Hi everyone, thank you for logging in and joining us for today's webinar. I'm just going to give everyone a few more seconds to join in and then we're going to get started. So if you want to grab a glass of water or a little snack or get more comfortable in your chair, now's the time. And we'll be starting in about half a minute. All right, I think we have a quorum and we can get started. So again, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, The Fundamentals of AI and Talent Acquisition. It's been a little while since I've hosted one of these, so I'm very excited to be here. I am also very excited because I'm going to get to do this with Jeet, who is an old-timer at Beamery and knows a ton about the subject of today's session. But I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute, and I'm going to get some housekeeping items out of the way first. So number one, definitely send in the recording of the session as well as the slides after the webinar. So if for some reason you have to drop off earlier, you will find these in your inbox tomorrow. So no worries at all if that has to happen. Second thing is, if you have questions, please do send them in. We absolutely have time earmarked for questions at the end of the session. You should have a questions module on your GoToWebinar control panel. So just use that and we'll get to them at the end. So that's for housekeeping. I also have on the next slide a little bit more information about this webinar and the series of which it is part. So AI and Talent Acquisition, the Fundamentals is only the first session in a webinar series on the role of AI in talent acquisition and talent transformation in general. And the next few sessions are going to talk about things like the unexpected risks and dangers of using AI in talent acquisition like it's a black box without really diving into what's behind it. The third session is going to talk about some of the use cases that have a lot of impact for AI, some of the goals that you can drive with AI and talent. And then the last one is going to be a panel with industry leaders, with talent practitioners, with AI consultants and specialists who are going to all bring their view of AI to the table to try and define a little bit or establish a little bit what the role of AI is going to look like in the near future in the context of talent strategy and of HR strategy. So all of these sessions are going to be super interesting. And if you haven't registered yet, please do register for these and we will be sending out links to all of these sessions in the follow-up to this webinar with the recording and the slides. So that's housekeeping, and I'm gonna now let Jeet introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he's gonna be talking about today, and then just dive into the subject. Jeet, please go on ahead.
Thank you, Nada. Hi, everybody. I am the product manager in the AI and data science team at Beamery. As Nada said, I've been here for a few years now, and it's been really exciting to see how we've grown the company over the last few years, and the focus on AI has really increased. And the timing seems really right in the market as well to capitalize on the trends of AI, which I'll talk through in more detail. As we go through this presentation, the type of content that we'll cover might also give you a glimpse of the kind of things that we prioritize when we think about AI and data science as well. So I'm excited to talk through the pieces that we're working on, talk through some of the fundamental concepts around AI, how you might go about assessing whether AI is right for you, where and how it can help, and kind of equip you with the right questions to ask vendors when choosing a solution. So with that, I'll kick off. And before diving into AI as a topic in and of itself, it's worth taking a moment just to look at where we are with talent as a whole in our new normal. In this post-pandemic world, so that we can contextualize the questions around AI that we care about. And the quote-unquote normal way of doing things has been hugely impacted by COVID, and talent was really one of the most impacted areas. There were hiring freezes, furloughs, budget cuts, and people reconsidering their jobs and careers more broadly with remote work. And despite all that, work still needed to be done. Things didn't really necessarily stop. So if you fast forward to today, what we're seeing, at least from our data, that there's been a year-on-year increase of 4.5 times at least in jobs posted across our customer base, while the number of candidates pipelined have increased by only about 46%. So what you can see here is that demand is outstripping supply in a huge way. And what we're seeing. Go ahead, Nada.
Oh, so sorry, G. I'm totally jumping in here. Privileges of the host, I guess.
Go
But
ahead.
you said these are, you said these are numbers from our customer base, so not maybe a totally perfectly representative sample, but definitely indicative, because I do know that we have customers across a wide base of industries, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's relatively representational across industries, primarily US based. That's where the majority of our customers are. A few in EMEA as well. So it kind of reflects what's happening across the on from us. But yeah, the trends that we're seeing as well, and the kind of questions that we're getting, at least from the prospects as well in the sales cycle, they're starting to have this kind of urgency that there's a lot of demand from having hiring freezes during the pandemic, and now they're starting to open that up, and they need to fill those capability gaps quite quickly. So yes, this is definitely our data, but it's kind of reflected in the conversations that we're having as well.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
No worries. So yeah, companies are rapidly trying to rebuild and fill their capability gaps at scale. And through that, what we've seen is that there's 3 areas of focus that have emerged, and in each area, AI can have a pretty significant impact. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about those 3 areas. The first one is there's a greater focus on internal mobility, and companies are starting to invest inwards more. And what we've seen from LinkedIn data is that internal mobility went up by 20% since the onset of COVID. And in the States, we're seeing trends of organizations reducing their recruitment budget and focusing more and more on things like learning and development, reskilling and upskilling, and moving more towards project-based cross-functional work. And you'll see how AI becomes increasingly important in this area. And really, this brings the question of how can AI help create better employee reskilling or upskilling experience aligned to business outcomes? And that's the key question there. The second area is a bigger focus and a heightened focus on DE&I. Research from Workplace Intelligence, which I think is a New York City-based HR research and advisory firm, showed that 70% of job seekers said they want to work for a company that demonstrates a commitment to diversity and inclusion as an explicit commitment. And that's never really been expressed that broadly and widely before. And DE&I from the company side has also become a top priority for primarily the more forward-thinking companies, with research from McKinsey showing that companies are increasing their spend in DE&I despite budget cuts elsewhere. So this brings the question of how can AI make the talent acquisition process more objective at scale? And the key here is the at scale part of this, because we can maintain levels of objectivity when we're having to deal with relatively smaller number of jobs and number of candidates. But when you start to do this at scale to try and meet the demand gap that has been created through the pandemic, suddenly it becomes far more difficult in order to do that. And the third area is recruiter productivity. So the pandemic has forced recruiters to adapt and kind of bring more clarity to the talent data they have at hand, to rethink how to connect with and advise talent during the pandemic, And now it's more about how to work through the demand of roles more efficiently without dropping the quality of candidates in process, plus how to gauge internal and external talent together. So this brings the question of how can AI help recruiters become more productive and make sense of different types of talent together to be more effective. So alongside this, the three things that we just talked through, more and more organizations are starting to consider the use of AI in HR, particularly in the areas that you see on the screen: workforce planning, learning and development, skills management, and performance management. And we saw from Gartner's AI survey from a couple of years back, they found that 17% of organizations already use AI in HR, and they expect next year another 30% to do so. So that's almost half. And they all kind of cite cost savings, more accurate database decision making, and improved employee experiences as some of the top reasons to deploy AI. And separately, we've also found another study by Mercer, also in 2019, and perhaps they had a more broader definition of AI, but from the 7,000 plus respondents that they had for the study, over 80% of organizations use AI across a range of HR tasks. So it's a huge amount where AI in some form or another, or at least automation, is being used. So really, there are two things that's happening here. The first is that we have a new landscape of needs where it matters more than ever that the AI plays a positive role if it were to be used. Because as you can imagine, in internal mobility and DE&I and recruiter productivity, AI gone wrong here can have a pretty significant negative consequence across all those areas. And secondly, AI is already becoming increasingly prevalent in the HR tech stack. So it's more important now than ever to know what AI can really do for HR, where not to use AI so that you get the best ROI from it, and how to choose the right AI solutions and how to implement it so you can get the best out of it in the end-to-end process. So before we go any further, the thing to note here, and this is something that I saw on LinkedIn quite recently from one of my connections, is that AI has its limitations, as you can see from this. Often AI projects are considered to have failed, and a lot of them do fail because our expectations are way, way grander than what the AI can do, and because our success metrics aren't really clear and aren't specific to that use case. So it's worth remembering that AI is not a magic bullet. It's not relevant for all use cases, and some activities and decisions, particularly in our world in HR, will always and should always, I hope you agree, require human judgment. So finally, you still need the right foundations in place for AI to work, such as the data, the right mindset and the readiness of the people within the organization, the right training and the implementation, and the right sponsorship from senior leaders in order to make AI successful within the business. So the next thing I want to look at with all of you is what are the right elements to focus on when it comes to AI. And on this slide, what you're seeing is some of the types of questions that we've heard before. And these questions may be somewhat relevant. They definitely are to some level, but they only really scratch the surface of what you need to know. So I want to spend a couple of minutes just looking at each of these questions quickly and examining them in a bit more depth. So if we look at the first one, do you use deep learning or machine learning? I'd ask, why is this important to know? Because some vendors may impress upon you that they use deep learning, but one is not necessarily inherently better than the other. It's more use case dependent. In some cases, deep learning is a better use of AI to solve that problem, and in some cases, your standard machine learning is a better use. So the real question here is, does the AI solve a relevant problem in an unbiased and explainable way, rather than whether it's deep or not? That's kind of a second order question. The next one, list all models used in your solution. Again, I'd ask, what will you do by knowing this kind of information? Is it going to really change anything for you when it comes to the decision making? And I'd love to hear your thoughts if it does. In our opinion, a better question might be, why are the models used in each case instead of non-AI methods? So rather than just knowing what the models are, more digging into why they're used and why we've chosen to use AI instead of other methods. And this helps to unpack whether AI is being used for AI's sake, and how much value it actually drives beyond simpler, more explainable and unbiased ways, such as rule-based methods or even manual methods, which keeps the control squarely in human hands. The third thing is, how large is your data set? And we've heard this quite a lot. We see this from our colleagues across different vendors as well. And in reality, having a larger data set for training models is worth considering, but it implies that it's a more balanced data set. That's what it's trying to get to, this question. but that's an assumption that should be tested. So it's better to ask an accompanying set of questions about how balanced the data set is and how varied and how representative of the real world scenarios it is. So definitely it's worth knowing how large the data set is, but more importantly, how does that reflect the real world scenarios? And we'll get to specifics soon around this in terms of what are the questions that you might ask instead of this. This is a favorite of mine. People tend to ask, how big is your data science team? And they tend to ask this because the underlying assumption is that the more data scientists you have, the better the models, or the larger the number of models, or to understand the maturity of the team. And in reality, there's little correlation between the size of the data science team and the accuracy of the models. It might be that they are working on more models, but the success metric shouldn't be based on the size of the teams, but the outcomes they are delivering. This is also another favorite of mine. Do you have a chatbot? It appears a lot in AI sections and RFPs. And this surfaces a bit of a misconception that all chatbots are AI, which isn't really true. And it assumes that chatbots are the solution when thinking of using AI in talent experiences, which may not always be the case. To give you an anecdote, we were recently advising an organization who had multiple chatbots, driven by the need to have AI in their HR tech stack with different decision makers making those calls about where to use the chatbots. But what they ended up with is they didn't know how to stitch those together to create a better experience on both sides of the coin. And this ended up creating a kind of a more confusing experience for talent acquisition teams, a misaligned experience for candidates, and a lot of disjointed data. So a better question instead of this might be, how do you use AI to improve the experience for candidates, employees, and recruiters? And as part of that, we allow the vendors to talk about if and where chatbots fits into the stack to see how might that then solve the overall problem. And then the final one, how do you ensure your AI is unbiased and explainable? Now, you might think this is a good question, and it is an important question, but it is a little too surface level to really understand what a vendor does to ensure objectivity and explainability. So if you really want to get to the heart of it, in reality, bias and explainability should be checked throughout the process. So being more specific about how the vendor handles objectivity and explainability at each step is important, from data gathering and processing to model development and deployment to the user experience and interfaces.
Jeet, I have another question actually about this. So all of these, I understand that all of these are questions that were raised at some point or other with you or other members of the team when you were advising organizations who were asking questions about AI in their talent set, right? So I guess my question is, how did these people that you were advising, these talent execs, how receptive were they to the idea that maybe this, for example, AI is not the optimal solution for a chatbot, that they can use something a lot more rule-based and it will work just as well and give them better results, or any of the other examples that you've given? Was there, and I guess what I'm trying to understand is how much of the motivation towards getting AI is we need to have AI in the system versus we need to drive results.
There is a little bit of that. There is a little bit of fear of missing out, of wanting an AI solution, because the underlying assumption that AI is going to be better. And in a lot of the cases, it can be, as long as it is implemented and integrated correctly. What we've seen is that where we have customers who are more willing to partner to solve their problems, we get a better outcome from there. You know, and this is why I love joining sales calls, because my goal there is not to sell. My goal is there to partner with someone and help them to solve their problems. And if those customers are willing to have conversations, what we've seen is that we hit that aha moment and we get to a better outcome, regardless of whether they end up going with us or not. They end up with a better solution that works for them. What we've seen is, however, that the prospects that are more purely RFP led and they have a specific set of questions, it's really difficult to have those conversations to understand what they actually need. So being a little bit more open from both sides to be able to understand how we can work as a partnership as opposed to a transaction has helped a lot previously to get that maturity level and education up, and also helps us to kind of understand how we might be able to point our AI to more of the prevalent questions and the pain points of people out there.
Yeah, and I guess that's That's normal. That's to be expected in an organization, a large organization that has to make decisions by involving a lot of stakeholders, and you have a lot of different motivations and reasons for making different decisions. And so it definitely takes a
Yeah.
little bit more partnership to get to a better solution. I understand that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah,
So
that was really my question.
great. So to kind of help bucket some of these questions and to understand what the right questions are to ask, we see the buckets as kind of these three areas: the data, the models, and the experiences. And this is really what we focus on when we're having those conversations that Nad and I were just talking about, where we partner with our prospects and customers, and we think about these three different areas to understand really what they need and how we can help them, and how our data, models, and experiences can help them to achieve their goals. And we think about these three things because these together should really account for the life cycle of AI at a high level. As you have the data that then feeds into the model, which then feeds into the experiences, and then the experiences generate more data, and we get more data from there to then improve the models, which then improves the experiences. So it's a virtuous cycle. And within these three areas, it's worth thinking about the types of questions within each of these, which can broadly fit into the categories on the right-hand side of the screens that you're seeing. So suitability, objectivity, explainability, validity, and security. So what I wanted to do for the majority of the call coming up now is to go through data, models, and experiences per bucket, and to kind of talk through what the questions might be under each of these categories that you could ask in order to understand whether the AI solution is right for you, and whether the AI solution is good enough to hit your outcomes that you're looking for. So if we look at data to start with, you can see the categories here. If we start with suitability, what you'll see is some of the questions that you might ask is, why are the chosen data points used to train the models? Is all of it relevant for the use case? And what sources of data are used and why? And asking more why around the choice around the data points that are chosen to train the models really helps to drill down into what they are trying to achieve, and therefore are they being intentional about the use of data, or is it more about just gathering the data in the hope that they will hit a goal? So i.e., is it AI for AI's sake, or is it more around trying to solve a business outcome and being more intentional about the data sources and limiting some of the risks that you might face by gathering too much data where it's not necessarily relevant. Second thing around objectivity is, and you'll be aware of some of the stuff, is how is the data checked for bias before it is used for training models? Being more specific about the data checks around bias at the beginning of the AI training is important. And also to ask, are there data points that may potentially cause bias, such as gender, race, and ethnicity, and how are these handled, and why are these there? You might find that some vendors explicitly choose to leave out things such as gender, race, and ethnicity, and other bias-causing data points from their initial data set to avoid any potential explicit bias from occurring. But what you need to check is, which is the third question, is the data representative of the distribution in the real world? So for example, let's say that a vendor has decided to remove those data points to reduce the chance of bias, but they haven't checked that perhaps the distribution when they got that data was actually 80% male and 20% female. If they remove that data from the beginning and don't have that awareness that the data is already skewed towards one gender, then they won't know that they're using data that is biased at the source. So having that kind of visibility at the data level is important to know how your models are going to be reacting and what are the experiences that they're going to be creating for your organization. Thirdly, explainability. How is the data segmented? So this kind of tees off from the data representation question. How does it split across geography? How does it split across industry? Is it going to be relevant for your industry, for your geography, for your company? And what are the steps that they are taking to make it relevant for you? That is something to dig into further. And how is the data stored and connected? Now, this might seem a bit of a left field question, but in reality, it's really important, because what we've seen, and we use the knowledge graph technology within Beamery as well for this reason, is that knowledge graphs allow you to explicitly model the data points and then build AI on top of that, which means that when we need to understand why an AI model is behaving in a certain way, we can look at the data points and how the data points are related to each other in the graph and see which data points are influencing the models. Whereas if they're stored in tables or in documents, And if they're disconnected, then it becomes a bit more difficult to explain how and why we got to the answer. So these kind of questions around where it's stored will help you to understand if something is more explainable at the data level or not.
Jeet, I'm going to interrupt you again. Sorry. I think this explainability concept is pretty important, and I just want to make sure that I get it right. And I wanted to ask as well because I want to make sure that we kind of surface what do we need to know as talent practitioners and what is okay for us to not fully understand because we're not trying to become technical experts, right? So you're saying it is important to understand how the data is stored, whether it's in tables or in graphs, because the way these data points are connected makes a difference in how explainable the model is. Can you just explain a little bit more what an explainable model is, and or give an example maybe of the difference between something that's explainable and something that is not?
For sure, yeah. And I'm glad you're keeping me honest on this one, because there is a chance to go into big AI rabbit holes here, which is a lot of fun, but perhaps for another call. So if we're thinking about, let's say, internal mobility, and we are looking at someone's potential career path that they could go down, if we are mapping someone's career path, it is far easier to do it in the knowledge graph, because it allows us to more easily represent the connections between the data points within that graph, and model the organization and model the connections between where someone is now and where they could be in the future much more explicitly. And you can literally visualize the graph and see someone's career path, and you can see the data points that are influencing those decisions along that graph. So if anybody asks, okay, why have you suggested this particular career path to me? I can point at the graph and say, this is why we're doing it. And if something is incorrect, then we can take the feedback from the user and improve that model. But if it's in tables and documents, there's a lot of nested information in those tables and documents, and it becomes far more, it becomes far less transparent. And it makes it much more difficult to explain why someone is being recommended a certain career path based on the data that is nested in those tables and documents.
So is the idea that someone using the AI tool that is making these recommendations would be more or less able to say, hey, I think I understand why this person was recommended after they are recommended. And maybe if someone is recommended for a reason that is not immediately apparent, they would be able to go and look into the data and see why the model made that inference, made that recommendation. And conversely, they would be able to say, this recommendation does not look like it makes sense, and they would know where to go and look to figure out. I'm trying to see if explainability only helps you understand why something is correct, or if it also helps you understand why when something might not be correct, because AI models are not perfect, right? Sometimes they spit out wrong answers and they keep learning in some cases. Please tell me if what I'm saying is not factually accurate. I am not the expert.
You're absolutely right. It not only allows us to see why an answer has been spat out by the model, but also allows us to see kind of a little bit into the future of why an answer might be wrong. And again, having that graph and the way that we complete the graph with our AI where data is missing allows us to again see what the model might predict in future as well, based on new data that we might get. So you're absolutely right. It gives us a little bit of an insight into what the model might say and be able to act on that. Whereas if you don't have that visibility, then it becomes very, very difficult to have that foresight and say, you know what, I think this might actually be incorrect. And you may not be able to fix it before it's too late.
Okay, so I totally see why this can be really, really important when you're going to be held accountable for all of these decisions that you make based on recommendations from your tools. If you're going to be told, it's why are you recommending all of these people, or why are you not recommending this set of candidates or that set of candidates? If you can have an explanation for why these decisions are happening, then you're a lot more confident in being accountable and standing for those decisions. I get why that's important. Okay, now I get the explainability thing, and I'm going to let you continue. Thank you.
Great, and we'll touch on explainability a little bit more in the model section as well as in the UI section. So this is just at the data level. So this helps explain, let's say, at the vendor to customer buyer level, why certain decisions are being made. But yeah, there's also explainability layers across the end-to-end stack. So what are we doing at the model and how is it explainable? And also, how do we explain to the user why certain decisions have been made? Next, we can look at validity at the data level. So within this, some of the questions that you might ask is, how do you maintain data quality? Is it complete, fresh, and deduplicated? And this is really important because it goes to the old adage of, garbage in, garbage out. If the data isn't fresh, if it is stale, if it's there's a lot of duplicates in there and there are overfitting in there, if it is incomplete, then the models being trained on top of this is not going to function as well as it should. So this is important to ask in terms of how is data quality maintained within their technology stack. And then finally, security. These will be familiar for you. And some of these are on what consent was obtained when the data was used or acquired. How is data per customer stored and used between other customers? This is an important one to understand what you're signing up to and how much data you're sharing between other customers, whether the data is anonymized or not, and also what steps are taken to ensure that data is securely stored and cannot be amended, or of course, in the worst case scenario, stolen. So once we've looked at some of these vectors within data, let's look at the model layer. So within models, one of the questions you might ask is, why were these models chosen over other models? So what tests were done to choose these particular models? And again, this gets to the heart of why someone is choosing to go down the AI route versus other ones, and whether they're keeping things as simple and explainable as possible, or whether things are getting more and more complicated and unnecessarily so. So it drives home to the maturity of the organization and choosing the most valuable model as opposed to the most complicated model. Next thing when it comes to models and objectivity is, how are the models checked for bias? Are there humans in the loop? Do we have any external checks and third-party checks available? And how often are they checked for bias? So is there a feedback loop available on that bias? And how are the models kept honest, essentially? On the explainability layer that Nat and I were speaking about earlier on, how does each model work individually and together to deliver on the use case? So ideally, the vendor should be able to draw you a diagram of data flows and how each model connects together, what they're trying to achieve, what are the metrics they're trying to use across each of those steps, and how they work together to deliver on the outcome. If they're not able to do that, then it becomes more and more difficult to understand how everything works together. We would expect this from, let's say, data flows within a software engineering project, and we should also expect the same kind of data flows from an AI project as much as possible. Within validity of models, here as well, you can ask questions such as, what are the quantitative and qualitative methods to use to check if models are working optimally? And it's important to spell out whether it's quantitative or qualitative, because depending on the model and the outcomes you're trying to hit, some will be more important than the other. And similarly with recall or precision and accuracy, and you can read about this online, so I won't be going into too much detail around the definitions of these, but it's important to understand whether the specific models are optimizing for something like recall or something like precision. And to kind of spell this out in an example, imagine that the vendor is suggesting candidates for a particular vacancy. Now, if they're optimizing for recall, it'll mean that they're optimizing for creating a longer list, so you have enough people to play with and enough people to create that list of people that you reach out to. If they're optimizing for precision, and there is a trade-off here, the list will be much, much shorter, but you may get, and this is what they'll ideally try and provide you with, is a super short list of hyper-relevant candidates that the AI hopes will be successful to at least, let's say, get to first round interview. So there's typically a balance, but depending on what they're optimizing for will give you different outcomes in terms of whether you're doing, let's say, bulk-based hiring or whether you're doing exec recruiting. So being able to refine and tweak the model to those separate use cases is important, again, depending on your use cases. And then finally, security, what steps are taken to ensure the models cannot be interfered with? And this is something that we've heard online, and we've seen online, there's been some cases where people have been able to maliciously interact with the models at the model level beyond the UI, and this has had some pretty negative outcomes. So are the models stored securely, and are they prevented from being interfered with from external sources, is a good question to ask when you're looking to choose a vendor.
Now I gotta ask, what
Sure.
is an example of when someone tries to interact maliciously with a model? Like, what does that look like? What happens?
Yeah, so there are two things that can be done here. Well, there's several things that can be done here, but I'll talk about two of those. One is they can feed the model a different set of data. And if that happens, then obviously you're interfering with the data source that's coming through, which means that the model behaves differently and it may fail. So to give you I suppose a comical example, let's say a model is being tasked to understand whether it's a cat or a dog, and you're only feeding in animal photos. Someone might then feed in, let's say, photos of avocados and really throw the model. And that's a very simplistic use case, but imagine you're using AI to detect whether someone has cancer or not from X-rays. Then that becomes incredibly important. And then the other point is beyond the data and at the model level, there's been some stories of attackers being able to change the code in the model so the model behaves differently in and of itself. That is more difficult to a little bit more difficult to detect, because at the data level you can kind of see it. At the model level, the code can be hidden. So what you're seeing is the data is going in, but for whatever reason, we are not getting the recommendations that we need. So that is also another way that certain malicious folk can influence what happens. So making sure that it's securely stored behind the right security frameworks is incredibly important.
All right, I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then finally, on the user experience level, so again, across all these buckets within suitability, some of the questions that you might ask is, how does the AI improve the user experience? So again, is it AI for AI's sake, or is it actually adding some value? And how much does it enable the users to achieve their goal more effectively than without AI? Could this have been done in a more explainable and human-led way instead of relying on AI? So how much ROI are you getting for it? On objectivity, how much influence does the user have over the model? So some vendors will say that you have the ability to influence the model so that we take in human input. The slight problem with that is that if a human starts to meddle with some of the data and some of the models, then it can lose some of the objectivity, because as humans, as amazing as we are, there are inherent biases within us. So if there is a level of tweaking that we can do to the model via the UI that can then change the way the model behaves, then we are taking in that person's biases into the model. So understanding where that line is drawn from the vendor side is important, but also understanding on the flip side, how does the user interaction and feedback on the models impact the model training? So getting feedback from the users is still important. So is there a process in place where that feedback is taken, and what thresholds are created for us to then use that feedback and say, yes, you know what, it's time we improve the model based on the feedback that we are seeing. On the explainability side, how is the AI explained to users? So is it clear on why the AI made recommendations, and is it easily understandable and reassuring? So I'll give you an example. Let's say we're looking at something like social media. So LinkedIn, Facebook, even Google search, which uses a knowledge graph. We trust it enough to not require increased amounts of explainability unless we want to dig further. When we're dealing with HR and humans, explainability becomes more important. So depending on the use case, it may not be a blanket. It may not require a full blanket explainability at 100% across all use cases, but where it's relevant and where it's necessary, is there appropriate explainability for the users at each of those use cases? It's good to dig into those things.
So what you're saying is we don't care as much about the fact, like about why Google recommended, for example, when I search for a specific book title, why it recommends other titles of seemingly unrelated topics, because Google decided that based on my past history search, I would like it. I don't really care as much with like why Google made those decisions, but we do care a lot about why the talent tools that we use make certain recommendations about candidates, and that's why we need to be able to explain them, to explain those decisions.
And in some instances, we may not care too much about explainability even in the talent space. Let's say, for example, you're doing high bulk hiring, and you're trying to understand and build up a long list of candidates in the pool. And after a few uses, you trust the model enough to say, okay, you know what, these, instead of looking through 500 candidates, you've given me 100 or even 70, let's say. I'm happy with those recommendations and I'm happy to sift through. But if you're looking at something which is a little bit more personalized, for example, in internal mobility use cases, at those moments, it becomes a little bit more important and more sensitive to explain to an employee why they're seeing those recommendations, because it personally impacts their career. So it is worth looking at a use case by use case level, how the company thinks about explainability and how the vendor explains explainability and handles it in the different use cases.
I see. Thank you.
No worries. And the last couple of points around the user experience with validity, how is the AI tested as part of the user experience and how do you measure success? So you might be able to test at the model level, looking at precision, accuracy, and recall and all those kind of scores. But actually, you're trying to hit the end outcome of being able to drive the needle, whether it's improving recruiter efficiency, whether it's driving internal mobility, whether it's making sure that you're hiring a diverse slate of candidates. And at that point, you want to see, okay, well, what are the success metrics to understand if the AI model is valid at the user experience level? And then finally, security here as well. So what are the steps that are taken to ensure that AI experience is secure and cannot also be interfered with, which echoes the point that Nada and I were talking about at the model level as well. And as we think about these three categories and those buckets of questions that we just spoke through, really at a higher level, if we're thinking a bit more holistically when choosing an AI solution, it's important to look at the broader solution as an indication of how good the AI is working and whether it's delivering results in an explainable, objective, and secure way. So across these three things, starting on the left-hand side, you might want to ask, how is the vendor solution being implemented? And if it's implemented well, and if there are use cases of that, and it's quick, and there's delight in the implementation, it means that the AI as part of the solution is being easily understandable, and there is a lower barrier to being used, which then leads to a better adoption. And similarly with this, if there's higher adoption, it means that the AI is intuitive enough and part of the workflow, naturally and organically part of the workflow, with a learning curve that isn't steep, and that one that is also delivering value. And if that happens, the final thing that you might want to check is how happy are the vendor's customers in using the broader solution. If the customer satisfaction is high, it means the AI is not only working as expected and as part of the end-to-end solution, but it's also likely delighting users. So with that, I'll leave you with three takeaways. The first one is, in the new normal, as we spoke about earlier, given the heightened focus on employee experience, on DE&I and recruiter productivity, and the growing demands on the TA team, it's more important than ever to understand how and why AI could enable your HR tech strategy. Alongside this, we're seeing a surge in AI adoption in the space, and it's going to continue to grow. So it's important to understand AI a little bit better to inform those technology decisions. Secondly, while you're considering that, it's important to note that AI is not a magic bullet, and knowing the limitations and where it can add the most value versus where it should not be used can help to ensure that the investment you're making in AI is sound and the results match your expectations. And thirdly, at the end of the day, AI is an exciting and pretty fascinating field, and it's good to understand the concepts such as machine learning and graph technology and deep learning, and we haven't dug into that too much today. And that's the reason we haven't done that is because to make good decisions about the AI tech you buy, you can really focus on these three things, which we covered in a bit more detail: the data, models, and experiences. Because no matter how great the technology is, if the data isn't up to scratch, you're not going to get the value from the AI that you're looking for. With models, they have to be accurate, but also explainable. If the vendor can't explain why certain models were chosen and how they contribute to the outcome, even if it's delivering more accurate results, you won't really be able to spot when it's not accurate or explain and correct it as we go along. And then finally, the experience, which is the most important thing, is it actually moving the needle and solving the appropriate problems for your teams, or is it just adding cognitive load? So I'll leave you with those 3 points. Thank you so much for listening in, and I hope that this has given you some insight into how to consider AI solutions as part of your HR tech strategy.
Thanks, Jeet. That was great. We did nerd out a little bit in there, so thank you for answering my questions. But you're right. This is this is a fascinating area of talent tech in general. Now that we're seeing more and more AI solutions cropping up, and so I am going to forgive myself for nerding out on that. But it is also why I think and I hope it is valuable for the audience and for everyone who's joined us today to take a little bit of time to maybe think about what we need to understand about this, and maybe what is okay for us to not necessarily understand about this, because this is not, AI is not our area of specialization or expertise. We're trying to focus on hiring the right people and finding the right people for our organizations and finding the right talent inside our organizations, right? So I'm hoping that everyone got a little bit of those fundamental ideas that you were just talking about at first, that it doesn't matter how cool or how accurate or how sophisticated the models are behind your AI tool, if the data that goes in is not kept up, it's not up to date, it's not rich. If half of it, for example, only has a quarter of the fields filled up, all of that means that you're not going to get a lot of value from your AI tool. So while the tool itself might be great, if the data that you have in your systems going in is not of high enough quality, you're not going to get the results that you're expecting. You're not going to get the returns that you're expecting from the tool. I also really liked how we talked about the three, I guess, steps of the life cycle of any AI technology. That the data goes in, the model works through that data, takes in the data and spits out a result, and then the resulting experience is what you get from it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a neat way of thinking about, okay, these are the three things that you need to care about for your AI tool. And if you're asking all of those questions about suitability and objectivity and explainability and validity and security about all these three steps, then you're covered, you're fine. You are going to be comfortable in the belief that you've covered all of the questions that might uncover some risks that you haven't thought about before. So yeah, thank you for talking us through that. I'm gonna ask you again to go back to the first slide, please, so I can remind everyone on the call. This session today was about some of those fundamental concepts that we talked about today around what matters about a talent AI technology, what questions you need to ask if you're trying to make the right decision about a solution that you're trying to buy, and all of that. But we are going to get into more subjects and more areas around this theme of AI with our next session, for example, the panel about hidden dangers of quote unquote black box AI. We're going to talk a lot more about use cases of AI to drive results, as opposed to maybe use cases that are more about the technology itself than about how suitable it is for you. And then finally, do not forget to check in again about our fourth session, Talent in 2025, Designing the Future. We're going to have some really exciting guests for that one, and we will communicate about those very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for the emails and for the announcements on the webinar landing page. And hopefully I'll see you all there again. Jeet, thank you for this presentation. Thank you for taking the time. It was really fun to have you on, and thank you for answering all of my questions.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna let everyone go now and say thanks again for joining, and please look out for the recordings and the slides in your email inboxes tomorrow, and see you for the next webinar. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks everybody.